Professor K.C. Abraham, distinguished chair, Dr. Tharoor, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to be asked by the Center for Public Policy and Research to deliver the first of their lectures in this series. As Tharoor mentioned, I said I would do it when I was next in Kochi. But unfortunately, the reason I'm in Kochi is the Emerging Kerala Conference. And not only was the Emerging Kerala Conference rather hectic, but emerging from the Meridian Hotel and the traffic there delayed me unconscionably this evening. And I want to apologize to all of you that we got underway a little later than we had planned to do. In fact, my mother now lives in Kochi, and on the way I was hoping to stop and have a cup of tea with her. But thanks to my failure to emerge from that part of Kerala, I'm afraid I couldn't do that. Now, the topic we have for today is the question of freedom of expression and communications challenges in the internet era. And I'm a little curious as to, since apparently the organizers were surprised by the presence of all of you, I'm curious how many of you are here because you saw the announcement I made about the speech on Twitter. Anybody here saw it on Twitter? One. Just one. Two. All right. Three. All right. Well, that's not, considering there are over 100 of you here, that's not a great advertisement for the reach of the internet. But I thought I would check anyway. All right. Well, let me start with a brief word about my own deeply rooted belief in freedom of expression and press freedom. I think of freedom of expression as a fundamental human right, one that helps guarantee all my other rights. Indeed, Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that people have the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. As a writer and a politician now, I'm conscious how fortunate we are to live in a society that guarantees us that right. Writers in some developing countries have to contend with the argument that development and freedom of expression are mutually incompatible. That the media, for instance, must serve the ends of development as defined by the government or operate only within the boundaries of what the official institutions, the social and religious authorities in some countries define as permissible. The developing world is full of writers, artists, and journalists who have to function in societies which do not grant them this freedom. For them, freedom of expression is the oxygen of their own survival and that of their society. But they are stifled. In countries where truth is what the government says or the religious establishment says is true, then freedom of expression is all the more essential to depict alternative truths which the society needs to accommodate in order to survive. And yet it is all too often absent, because in many countries there are those who question the value of freedom of expression, freedom of speech in their societies. Those who argue that it threatens stability, and those who still consider freedom of speech a Western import, an imposition from abroad, and not the indigenous expression of every people's demand for freedom. What has always struck me about this argument is that it is never made by the people, but by governments. Never by the powerless, but always by the powerful. Never by the voiceless, but by those whose voices are all that can be heard. Let us put this argument once and for all to the only test that matters: the choice of every people to know more or to know less, to be heard or to be silenced, to be able to stand up or to kneel down. Only freedom of expression will allow the world's oppressed and underprivileged and marginalized a way out of the darkness that shrouds their voices and their hopes. The internet has now been giving them this choice as never before. But before I turn to the internet, let me first speak about traditional media. Media freedom is a vital aspect of freedom of expression. The free press often marks the difference between a society that is able to protect itself from abuses of human rights and one that falls victim to oppression and injustice. The media must always use its freedom to raise the awkward question, to probe beyond the obvious evident reality, to awaken the dormant consciousness, and therefore, yes, sometimes to subvert the established order. Freedom of expression is ultimately the best guarantee of liberty, of change, and of progress. It is the mortar that binds together the bricks of our freedom, and it's also the open window embedded in those bricks, which would, in Mahatma Gandhi's famous metaphor, allow the winds of the world to blow freely through our house. As Indians, we know that there is no development without democracy, and no democracy without freedom of speech. That is why I have condemned the arrest of cartoonist Asim Trivedi, as Abraham mentioned, and publicly expressed the hope that the judiciary would affirm his freedom of expression. There is widespread recognition today that restraints on the flow of information directly undermine development and progress in the 21st century. In this era of globalization, global interdependence means that those who receive and disseminate information have an edge over those who curtail it. In the age of the internet, there can be little argument that free information and freedom go together. The information revolution is inconceivable without political democracy and vice versa. Already the spread of information has had a direct impact on the degree of accountability and transparency of governments throughout the world. The internet has been made possible by advances in technology, and has also, of course, made them possible. These have also transformed the traditional media. Technology that is lighter to carry, simpler to use, and comes at a fraction of the cost of the old days, has already changed television reporting. Not so long ago, a ton of equipment was flown into a trouble spot. A satellite dish the size of a house was set up. Then a story was born. And that's where the satellite dish stayed, and that's where the story stayed. The journalist stayed there. So until the dish could be moved on, you were stuck with that story. Now, digital technology is producing cameras at 1/10 the cost of yesterday's. Simple enough to be operated by a non-technician, the reporter himself, with pictures that can be sent down the telephone line. The simpler to use, more affordable technology has truly democratized television news. Smaller, less well-financed news-gathering organizations and independent operations in developing countries have all benefited from this revolution. But so has the story too, because no story will be too remote to reach, too hard to get to, too expensive to cover, or too difficult to transmit. One reporter and a telephone line will often be enough. And this kind of technological innovation has also made the internet a vital source of news and analysis without any of the limitations of reach that television has. Mind you, television is still evolving, as is the internet, and there is increasing possibility of the convergence of the two. But if I may be permitted to be slightly facetious, I'm told Kerala audiences never have a sense of humor, but I'll try anyway, that technological change offers great hope, or great grounds for hope. Have you heard, for instance, about the latest television set? Whenever the words Baba Ramdev are uttered, it automatically changes channels. Anyway, the new hallmarks of freedom of expression today are the ability to retrieve, to receive, to download, and to send information through electronic networks, and the capacity to share information, whether on a newspaper or a TV screen, or on an online website, without censorship or restrictions. We already had our first walkout, can you imagine? The information society of the 21st century can only, in many ways, can only thrive if citizens are provided with full information to allow democratic participation at all levels in determining their destiny. New digital technology offers great possibilities for enhancing traditional media and for combining them with new media. Moreover, traditional media, and especially radio and television, remain the sole form of access to the information society for most of the world's population, as Professor Abraham pointed out. So many people don't have access to the media. The very poor, the illiterate, for them, of course, this is essential. But technology has become the biggest asset for those who seek to promote and protect freedom of expression around the world, and the reach of technology is going further and further into our society. Now this brings us to the era in which we are living today, the era of the information revolution, the internet, and the World Wide Web, and the extraordinary transformation in the reach and range of our freedom of expression made possible by social media. Just the day after he was sworn in as our 13th president, Pranab Mukherjee announced that he would be opening a Facebook account to receive and respond to comments and queries from the public. In fact, his fellow Bengali, Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal, has beaten him to it. The popular and widely read website that the media mines daily for news stories about her views. Just 3 years ago, when I first went on social media, it was fashionable for Indian politicians to sneer at the use of Twitter and Facebook. Today, our new president has made it clear that these are essential tools for credible and accountable political leaders. This is all the more striking because I once asked a distinguished senior politician what he thought about the emergence of these social media tools. Wouldn't they help in getting our message across, I asked? Why weren't they more widely used? Was it ignorance or was it apathy? And he replied, I don't know and I don't care, which rather sums up the problem of both ignorance and apathy. Now, the reach of social media has been facilitated by rapid technological developments as well. When we speak of social media, we do not mean only media running on a desktop computer or a mainframe server. In a famous study, my good friend Nick Garling of the BBC highlights how in a moment of major unexpected crisis, the institutions of power, whether political, governmental, military or corporate power, face a new acute vulnerability of both their influence and their effectiveness, thanks to the new media technologies. In the 21st century, it is impossible to ignore the issue of the uncontrolled impact of instant news on the workings of society and more generally on the impact of new media technologies on political affairs. Gowing pointed out how a chance video just taken by a New York investment banker completely changed public perceptions of the police handling of the G20 protests in the UK, because this banker's 41 seconds on his cell phone camera, mobile phone camera, exposed the police version of how a particular protester died. And so instant accountability followed. When US-led NATO warplanes bombed a village in Afghanistan, in Azizabad, a couple of years ago, US forces initially claimed that only 7 people had died. NGOs claimed, on the other hand, that 90 people had died. But then mobile phone video emerged. Some people had filmed the results of the bombing. And then American military commanders had to accept that they should re-examine their claims, and they had to revise the death toll up to 55. As Gowing argues, such examples confirm how new information technologies and dynamics are together delivering a wave of democratization and accountability. It shifts and redeems the nature of power in such moments, and I'm quoting from him here, it also creates a new policy vulnerability and brittleness for institutions who then struggle even harder to maintain public confidence, unquote. Now globally, it's true that most institutions of power still do not appreciate the full scale and implications of the dramatic new real-time media trend and its profound impact on the credibility of governments. Increasingly, a cheap camera or a mobile phone that is easily portable in your pocket can undermine the credibility of governments despite the latter's much larger, massive human and financial resources. The new lightweight technologies available to almost everyone mean that they enjoy a new capacity for instant scrutiny and accountability that is way beyond the influence of the traditional media. The world is full of examples of what Gowing calls non-professional information doers. Who is a non-professional information doer? You and I. Because we can go out on the street today, see something, take a picture on our mobile phone, and that can become the news on the internet. As many as 5 billion people worldwide including 84% of Americans, more than 70% of Chinese, and perhaps 60% of all Indians today now use mobile phones. They all get messages out, and they do so more rapidly than the official mechanisms can. Their strength is that they enable people to issue and disseminate material, including raw footage and compellingly authentic images, before the mainstream media, for that matter governments, can do so. Inevitably, this means that they can shed light where officials would prefer darkness, as China learned when video footage of a shootout involving Uyghur separatists in 2008 made it to the world media despite Beijing's denials. The core implications are striking. We've all heard about the so-called 24/7 news and media cycle. But with social media, the pressure of the news cycle will build up not just over a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week period, but sometimes in just a few minutes. As images, facts, and allegations emerging from cell phones and digital cameras go viral, they undermine and discredit official versions, present an alternative reality in the face of government denials, and fueled by dissenters and expatriates, they rebound onto the evolution of the situation itself. Twitter, for example, and of course digital cameras, had a huge impact on the Iranian protests after the disputed election of President Ahmadinejad. Despite Tehran's attempts to manage the crisis, social media kept the protests alive for far longer and with more prolonged intensity than they could have survived without the digital fuel. With such intense scrutiny, governmental power is rendered more vulnerable. The WikiLeaks saga demonstrated this too, since the publication of classified material on the internet circumvented both governmental control and the restraints that are normally observed by traditional media. In the old days, governments assumed they could command the information high ground in a crisis. That is simply no longer true. This brings me inevitably to the Arab Spring. The role of social media websites such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, Skype, in the political revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, with ripples elsewhere in the Middle East, notably in Syria now, have given new impetus to the discussion of social media on world politics. The eminent American journal Foreign Affairs had a whole debate on this, in which one person argued that in fact the whole dynamics of the political sphere have been altered by such tools as Twitter and Google and so on, and others have argued, no, you can only sustain this argument if these protests would not have occurred without Twitter and Google and Facebook, and that of course cannot be proven. My own position is somewhere between these two sides of the argument. Of course uprisings can occur and have occurred without Twitter or even Google. But media always has an impact on the reach and spread of a word about an uprising, and therefore has an impact on its intensity and its sustainability. In this case, I would argue that satellite television, notably Al Jazeera and its imitators, as well as mobile phones and SMSs, that had probably much more of an impact on the spread of the unrest across these North African Arab countries than Facebook or Twitter. But the impact is undeniable, and in fact it's pointless to dispute it, because there is no question that the global generation of young people are continuing now to retain and use the capacity to reach out to each other, and in situations of turmoil they will of course do so all the more. This is why China has paid particular attention to censoring the internet. They employ 40,000 cyber police to monitor blogging sites, shutting down any sites that get out of line, and they have of course banned Twitter in China. When a US-based Chinese language site called for a Jasmine revolution in China, the Great Firewall of China blocked all searches for the word jasmine, even if you were merely looking for jasmine tea. Clearly, the authoritarians in Beijing are quite aware of the enormous potential of social media to disrupt even their policies. Of course, there can be a more positive and non-controversial use of social media in a crisis. This we saw with the catastrophe of the tsunami, earthquake, and nuclear accident in Japan a year ago. Within days of the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, 64% of all blog links, 32% of Twitter news links, and the top 20 YouTube videos all carried news and information about the crisis in Japan. 9 days after Japan's catastrophic earthquake, in fact, 2 urgent pleas for help appeared on the Twitter account of the US ambassador. He had a Twitter account, so people wrote to him saying, there are patients in a hospital within the radioactive zone who have to be urgently evacuated. So he in turn contacted the American military who report to the US Embassy. They contacted the Japanese self-defense forces, and these patients were evacuated. Just a few years earlier, how would anybody have been able to reach the American ambassador like that in a publicly available medium to activate such response in a crisis? These are the kinds of changes that today we are seeing in Twitter. And in fact, social media websites like Twitter are using this freedom of expression that ordinary people enjoy to actually deal with humanitarian problems. Because what's happening, quite frankly, is that when you are trying in an emergency, for example, to find people, the best source is people. So somebody takes a picture of a refugee camp where some displaced people are there and they post the pictures up. Google has invented something called People Finder. So they post these pictures. Somebody else is wondering about his missing cousin or sister in another city. They go on Google, People Finder and say, oh, that's my cousin, that's where he is. Now this kind of thing has been used, very sophisticated of course in Japan, but even in a poor country like Haiti, it has also been used after the earthquake there. And the result of all of this is that we are actually finding a two-way conversation in impact zones taking place, finding people, getting urgent information on emergencies. In fact, even the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, in getting messages out to the people about nuclear contamination, what to do, etc., they use YouTube rather than any other means to be able to illustrate what people should understand about this. About 200 million people a day watch videos on their mobile phones. We haven't yet got that capacity sufficient in India, but it's coming. And that's already triple the number of a year ago. So social media is going to be inescapable in all future international crises and disasters. On any given day, people are sending 140 million Twitter messages a day. That is nearly 1 billion Twitter messages every week. There are two ways to look at this. Either that it's symptomatic of information overload, or that it represents a huge audience of information generators and consumers that people in positions of public responsibility ignore at their peril. My own sympathies, as you all have guessed, lies very much towards the latter view. In India, the case for social media has been gaining ground. We're already one of the world's leading countries in the use of Twitter, and social media, I think we're second to the United States, in fact. Even though the United States has 92% internet penetration, and India has barely 10 or 12% internet penetration. We're already number 2 in the use of Twitter. Social media is bound to gain as the prospects for e-government improve by the day. Though our government's information technology department has sent out new rules on internet intermediaries which have created a firestorm in cyberspace, in parallel, the first draft of the Electronic Delivery of Services Bill 2011 has proposed that all ministries and all government departments will have to deliver services electronically, whether through the internet or through mobile phones. So India is not just on the right track, but bids fair to become a model of e-governance in the developing world. And yet the recent controversies about the government's alleged desire to censor Facebook, Twitter, and other leading lights of the social media has obscured our progress in this area and also raised some genuine and urgent questions we need to address about free speech in our society. The problem arose when the New York Times reported that our telecoms minister, Kapil Sibal, had called on senior social media executives from Facebook, Microsoft, Google, and Yahoo, and allegedly asked them to pre-screen user content from India that is disparaging, inflammatory, or defamatory, to remove it before it goes online. Now, such a request, of course, inevitably sparked off a firestorm of internet protest against the minister without waiting to hear his side of the story. Facebook pages sprang up to denounce him, web boards overflowed with nasty comments against the minister, the ruling party, and the government, suggesting they were trying to protect a political leader, and the hashtag #IdiotKapil Sibal started trending on Twitter. all a bit over the top. As a frequent recipient of disparaging, inflammatory and defamatory content myself, I am no great fan of unpleasantness on any media, social or otherwise, but I'm strongly opposed to censorship. Freedom of speech is fundamental to any democracy, and many of the most valuable developments in India would not have been possible without it. Freedom of speech I've already spoken about at the very beginning, but when we look at censorship, we have to really say that it is a disservice to both the rulers and the ruled. Free speech advocates see that as an absolute statement, but I have to add a but. But every society recognizes some sensible restraints on how free speech is exercised. Those restraints almost always relate to the collectivity. They arise when the freedom of the individual to say what he wants to say causes more harm to more people in society than restricting his freedom would. In the United States, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes put it memorably when he said that freedom of speech does not extend to the right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theatre. Why? Because obviously that could cause a stampede in the crowded theatre, people could get trampled upon, injured and even killed, and the theatre's property destroyed, all consequences that outweigh the individual's right to shout out the word fire. Now, since societies vary in their cultural and political traditions, the boundaries also vary from place to place. Free speech absolutists tend to say that freedom is a universal right that must not be abridged in the name of culture. But in practice, such abridgment often takes place, if not by law, then by convention. No American editor would allow the N-word to be used to describe black Americans, not because it's against the law, but because it would cause such offense as to be unacceptable to use. Just as the commonplace practice of women taking off their bikini tops at Saint-Tropez, Copacabana or Bondi Beach could not be replicated on the beaches of Goa, Dubai or Karachi without risking assault or arrest, so also things might be said in the former set of places that would not pass muster in the latter. It's no use pretending that such differences of culture, politics and sensibility do not exist. They do. And that's the reason why free speech in, say, Sweden isn't the same as free speech in Singapore. The problem is particularly acute on social media because it's a public forum for the expression of private thoughts. The fact is that social media's biggest asset is also its biggest problem. Its strength is that social media enables ordinary people, not just trained journalists, to share vivid, real-time, unfiltered images and text reports before any other source, including governments or traditional media, can do so. Even more, any individual with the basic literacy to operate a keyboard can express his or her opinion, create information, whether video or text, and communicate it immediately to the world, without the delays necessarily wrought by editorial controls, cross-checking, or even the synthesizing that occurs in a newsroom. Imagine if you wanted to express your freedom of opinion in a newspaper by submitting an article. Some editor will read it, will decide if they like it, might edit it, might cut it for reasons of space or for content, might change something in it, then get your approval, then publish it. There's a whole series of fact-checking and so on that goes through. But on the internet, none of that exists. You write what you want, one click of the mouse and it's released to the world. And that has certain extremely important challenges because with one click of the mouse, it can go viral. And in the 21st century, no democratic political dispensation can afford to ignore that. Now this freedom, of course, is its own biggest threat. It means that anyone can say literally anything, and inevitably many do. Lies, distortions, and calumny go into cyberspace unchallenged. Hatred, pornography, and slander are routinely aired. There is no fact-checking, no institutional reputation for reliability to defend. The anonymity permitted by social media encourages even more irresponsibility because people hidden behind pseudonyms feel free to hurl abuses that they would never dare to utter to the recipient's faces. The borderline between legitimate creative expression and disparaging inflammatory defamatory content becomes much more difficult to draw. On my friend Kapil Sibal, his main concern was not with politics, but with scurrilous material about certain religions that could have incited retaliatory violence by their adherents. People say or depict things on social media that might be bad enough in their living rooms, but are positively dangerous in a public space. The challenge of regulating social media is that the person writing or drawing such things does so in the privacy of his home, but releases them into the global commons. My own yardstick is very clear. I reject censorship. Art, literature, and political opinion are to me sacrosanct. But publishing or circulating inflammatory material designed to incite communal feelings is akin in our society to dropping a lighted match at a petrol pump. No society can afford to tolerate it, and no responsible government of India will allow it. Personally, I'd rather snuff out that match than close down the petrol pump. In other words, that regulation may be necessary to protect our larger freedoms. But I'm still not suggesting that I agree that prosecuting Facebook or Google is the right way to go about it. After all, can you sue the phone company for someone sending a defamatory or obscene SMS? The analogy to a newspaper is wrong. These social network sites are more like the postman carrying the newspaper to your door. You would prosecute the newspaper for publishing legally actionable material, but you would not prosecute the postal service. Our learned judges are now examining the matter, but I hope they will take into account these realities of the internet era. In fact, Professor Abraham alluded to the use of the internet to spread panic in our country through distorted images of alleged atrocities against the Muslim community in the Northeast. In fact, innocent pictures such as Tibetan monks helping the victims of the earthquake there were uploaded on the net, and the headline said that this is victims of massacres by Northeasterners of Muslim people. And this kind of thing created an extremely negative environment on the internet with threats of retaliation against Northeasterners, the panic that led so many Northeasterners to flee from all parts of India back to their regions. And yet, the medium cannot be fully blamed. The medium can be misused, but we must act against the message and not the messenger. I would be not in favor of taking any action against the internet or the sites that were used, but rather against those who posted these deliberately distorted messages. But that sort of action becomes necessary. Because I need to affirm to you today how useful social media is in our society. Social media can be used to create knowledge networks, disseminate information, keep track of the world around you beyond what is available in our daily newspapers. In fact, a young Indian blogger called Mahima Kaur wrote recently, "Personally, Twitter is a better source of news than any newspaper homepage can hope to be, and Facebook keeps me abreast of my friends in a way email or simple phone calls could not do." So, for me, this is something that we have to understand about the use of all of these things. Of course, sometimes people get nasty, but you should ignore them, block them, cut them out, or shut your own reaction to those people down. I suppose I was the first government official in India to engage with the general public online on Twitter. Though in all fairness, L.K. Advani's blog, his webpage, had already created a lot of buzz during the last elections. More and more politicians are online today, including Narendra Modi and Sushma Swaraj of the BJP, and Digvijay Singh, Anil Shastri, Naveen Jindal, Manish Tiwari, and Hamdullah Saeed of the Congress Party, with politicians issuing their own bulletins and actually answering individual questions online. We have one minister too on Twitter, after my departure from the ministry, Milind Devra, our Minister of State for Communications, is regularly on Twitter. Now sometimes this creates its own challenges. The leader of the opposition in our lower house, in our Lok Sabha, Sushma Swaraj, has already blamed Twitter's 140-character limit for an imprecisely worded message about our Prime Minister that created political waves within the BJP. Of course, there is a safety net that politicians can always type, delete, and retype before pressing enter. But Ms. Swaraj reportedly dictates her Twitter messages, so perhaps that is more difficult for her. The Indian bureaucrats have been following suit. Perhaps the best-known example was former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao, a fellow Malayali. She, in turn, may well have been inspired by the success of the Ministry of External Affairs Public Diplomacy Division, whose officials, with my active encouragement, set up a Twitter page and have been pursuing social media strategies, including a Facebook page and a YouTube channel, to let people know about what the ministry and the diplomatic missions are doing. This has enabled them to promote India's soft power, even within the country, by creating goodwill among social media users in general, whether in India or abroad. To me, the MEA's initiative was excellent. It put India on a par with the Western democracies, which have already adopted social media sites as an instrument of outreach. But today at the Emerging Kerala Conference, I was welcoming the British High Commissioner, and he was telling me that he's under instructions from his government to be on Twitter. That is the attitude many countries have now. You have to use these media to reach out to the world. And of course, we increasingly hear about what's called public diplomacy, which is, again, a tool using social media to interact with people. Now, the pitfalls of social media are the ever-present risk that something said on a social network could itself be taken out of context or misused by our critics. Recently, well-wishers urged Jammu and Kashmir Chief Minister Omar Abdullah to delete a light-hearted remark that could have been maliciously distorted by his political enemies. He did so, with the curious result that the advice to delete can still be found on Twitter, but the potentially offending remark itself has disappeared. Responses to questions are particularly vulnerable to being issued in haste and without the usual careful vetting that more formal statements undergo. In my case, for example, when a journalist asked me, "Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class?" I think you all know what my answer was, and I'm still paying the price for that. So this is one of the dangers that one has. Now the fact is that at the same time, these media can be very effectively used. The Delhi police has a Facebook page. India Post helps you track your parcels through Twitter. The Pune City Council provides information on garbage disposal. I don't think the Trivandrum City Council is going to be able to do that, though. And of course, the census authorities in our country have an extensive internet presence. So all of this shows that if you are willing to make the effort required, freedom of expression can help both the governors and the governed. It means, of course, having a team in place to deal with all the questions that come up and being interactive. If you're a non-responsive social media site, then it can be seriously counterproductive. So it's a way of telling the authorities you have to trust your people. Just as in those emergencies, people are the best source of information. For a government too, people's freedom to express their views on the internet can be an extremely effective way of putting your finger on the electronic pulse of the nation. But you have to be able to respond effectively, otherwise it will not work. Now, in my view, there is absolutely no reason why India should not do better at this. My own experience with Twitter has had its positives and its negatives, but in my view, the positives outweigh the negatives. It's an extraordinary interactive broadcast medium, an interactive Akashvani. With one message today, I can reach almost 1.5 million people, 15 lakh people, and that number keeps increasing every day. I mean, which politician would turn down an audience of 15 lakhs of people, right? As I discovered during my time in government, I can also use it to put out information that the mainstream media may not be interested in. My visit to Liberia, for example, was the first ministerial visit in 38 years to that African country. It was completely ignored here in India by the mainstream media. But through my updates and a couple of links I posted, India's Africa diplomacy got more widely known through Twitter. In another example, a girl from my constituency who was amputated in both legs after a railway accident got offers of help from across the world because I tweeted about her. So I believe that you can use social media to demystify governance and sensitize people to the daily life and challenges of people in authority. And certainly after leaving the ministership, I've been able to expand my conversation with politically engaged people around the globe. Of course, I've never shared any politically sensitive information about any government meetings or anything like that on Twitter. But you must know that the politicians around the world are using this medium. President Obama, Hillary Clinton, pretty much every major foreign minister is on Twitter. and so on. This is a very, very widespread practice now around the globe, and we should not look at it in India as frauds in a very small way. Now, in my view, a democratic politician should not resist a new communications medium. The name Twitter initially put me off, and indeed it has led people to suggest that it is not a suitable medium for a serious politician. The BJP's Venkaiah Naidu even presciently warned me in public that too much tweeting can lead to quitting. But I suppose his colleagues have, like me, come to realize that Google and Yahoo were also silly names that are now household terms. I'm convinced that a large number of politicians in 21st century democracies, including India, will be tweeting 10 years from now. Those who are ahead of the curve, however, are rarely appreciated. Twitter is only a vehicle. The message is the issue, not the medium. I believe that many politicians increasingly understand that the kind of things I'm doing brings into my party's ambit a large number of people who might otherwise be indifferent to politics, to the Congress party, even to the government. I just need to take care, of course, to ensure that the message is not misunderstood. And there are various other positive uses of social media. I've really taken more time than I intended to, so I want to wrap it up. But you find, for example, students from India and Pakistan who meet at an international youth conference are in touch with each other by social media, by Twitter and Facebook, even at a time when visa restrictions and other travel problems and the tensions after 26/11 would have made direct physical contact very difficult. They can have virtual contact in this way. We have found, for example, that we can interrelate ourselves, the Pakistani journalists or politicians, through social media, and they can react to us. I have an entire following of Pakistanis on Twitter who give me comments, ask me questions, react to what I have to say, and follow India in that way. The ultimate clinching argument might even come from the marketplace, because in the dizzying valuations of social media sites going way beyond their earnings or dividends. There's a sky-high valuation. Twitter is supposed to be worth $10 billion. Facebook, of course, when it went public, dwarfed it because it went public at $106 billion this year. Dollars I'm talking about. Of course, today's news is that Facebook has lost about 1/3 of that in value since it went public. But still, even at its current stock market price, Facebook's value is still higher than real-world businesses like Ford or MasterCard or Visa. And that is still less than 1/3 of Google's value, which is something that makes the mind boggle at where it will all reach in the years to come. In other words, in the era of the internet, freedom of expression through social media is here to stay, and we need to live with it. Quite simply, we will not be able to live without it, so let's make the most of it. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you, and Jai.
സാറ് നല്ല എഴുത്തുകാരനാണെന്ന് എനിക്കറിയാം. അപ്പോൾ സാറിനൊരു എഴുത്തുകാരനായിരിക്കുന്നതാണോ ഒരു രാഷ്ട്രീയക്കാരനായിരിക്കുന്നതിലാണോ താല്പര്യം?
രണ്ടിലും താല്പര്യമുണ്ട്. പക്ഷേ ഞാൻ എപ്പോഴും പറയും, ഞാനിപ്പോൾ ഒരു ഫോമർ മിനിസ്റ്റർ ആയിരുന്നു പറയുന്നത്, മുൻ മന്ത്രി എന്ന് പറയുന്നു, ഒരു ദിവസം മുൻ MP ആവും, പക്ഷെ ഒരിക്കലും മുൻ എഴുത്തുകാരനാവില്ല. അതാണ് എനിക്ക് നോക്കുമ്പോൾ ഞാൻ കുട്ടിക്കാരൻ മുതൽക്ക് എഴുതാൻ തുടങ്ങിയത്. എൻ്റെ ആദ്യത്തെ കഥ 10 വയസ്സിലാണ് പബ്ലിഷ് ചെയ്തത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ എപ്പോഴും ഞാൻ എഴുതിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കും. ഈ കാലത്ത് ഞാൻ രാഷ്ട്രീയം ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്, എഴുതുകയും ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്. രണ്ടും നടത്താൻ ഒരേ സമയത്ത്.
അല്ല സർ, സാറിന്റെ ഐഡിയാസ് ഒന്നുകൂടെ തുറന്നു പറയാൻ സാധിക്കുന്നത് എഴുത്തിലൂടെയാണല്ലോ. അങ്ങനെ രാഷ്ട്രീയത്തിൽ പലതും ഒളിച്ചു വെക്കേണ്ടി വരുന്നുണ്ട്, പുറത്തു വരുന്നില്ലെങ്കിലും.
ഒളിച്ചു വെക്കുകയല്ല, പക്ഷെ ചില കാര്യങ്ങൾ പറയാൻ ആവശ്യമില്ലെങ്കിൽ പറയണ്ട എന്നാണ് ഇപ്പോൾ രാഷ്ട്രീയത്തെ പഠിച്ചിരിക്കുന്നത്.
Sir, I was a regular reader of your Shashi Tharoor column. But from that only I came to know that you are a very bold, very open-minded, very stubborn, very elegant person. And I came to meet and hear personally. But your expression, because all Indians should be like that. Thank you. Because we must be bold. We must live boldly. We must die boldly. Because we are born as vertebrates, not invertebrates. Because God has created us as vertebrates. we should raise our as Rabindranath Tagore here said that my head should be high.
Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high. Where knowledge is free.
He said, because every Indian should proud of the great person, Rabindranath Tagore. Even Mahatma, Tagore only first called or take on the Mahatma. Such a person, we are privileged to be here in this India. As a citizen of India, we should be proud of the great Rabindranath Tagore who has written that poem.
Thank you very much. Yes, there's a lady here.
So, thank you so much for the wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
I was thinking, in terms of accountability or responsibility, you can't expect all the citizens to be prudent and be rational. So you need some sort of mechanism to ensure that kind of responsibility. So if not censorship, then what is, because you don't have a point to intervene the participation. And especially in this era, we're talking about digital inclusion and all that. You have UID and everything. You're talking about 1.5 million. What about the rest that's left out? I don't think we're ready yet for that kind of inclusion. So what do you think about this point of intervention?
No, it's a very good point, because in fact you cannot intervene before something goes on the net, which is the first mistake that some people in the government seem to make. In other words, anybody can write anything and post it on the internet. It is physically impossible for the internet service providers to prevent it going on. But what you can do is, where something is posted that is inflammatory, that is defamatory, that is inciting people to hatred or violence, we should crack down at that point on those who have put such messages up. Not
But don't you think prevention is better than punishing them?
prevention, but how can you physically do it? The technology does not permit it. Even the Chinese, they are far more repressive than us, and their yardstick is much tighter. Obviously, we are a democracy; they are not. So we should never follow the Chinese example. But even they can only stop things after. Mind you, they have various other techniques. They use computerized searches for certain banned terms or words, so that if anybody uses one of those words in a blog site, immediately it alerts the cyber police and they intervene. Sometimes the blog itself gets taken down when that happens. So China is an extreme case, but even they cannot do anything before it is up there. So the worst things can be said against the Chinese for a few seconds or a few minutes, or sometimes a few hours before they catch it and take it down. I would never want India to be a country that employs cyber police. I would rather we wait until people officially complain. We should just have an effective regulatory mechanism so that when there is anything wrong, people can complain and that can immediately be objected to. But there will still be severe limitations in that because of the capacity of the medium to go viral. Let's say that you post something really nasty and false. By the time he has complained about it and we have taken it down, 100 other people may have copied it and released it, and their own copies might have been copied by others, and then beyond that you can't do anything about it. So, to some degree, as I argue, the medium is going to ensure increasing freedom of expression around the world, including irresponsible freedoms. But I suppose the only hope would be if the technology can be developed to be able to eliminate certain kinds of things, nasty things off the net, wherever they are copied and replicated. I'm not sure we're there yet, but that may be the only way to go. I would not be in favor of pre-censorship, but in any case it's technologically difficult short of shutting down the internet. And I would also have very severe misgivings about computerized or automated censorship methods. For example, there are many places where people cannot write to me Shashi, Tharoor, because when you write Shashi, Tharoor together, in the middle, unfortunately you get a rude word which is banned in many university campuses, websites and intranets and so on. And so automatically they cannot be in touch. It's a bizarre thing. They cannot even go on I used to have a website called shashitharoor.com. Now it's just tharoor.in. That problem doesn't arise.
Yes. Good evening.
Last question.
It's always a pleasure.
Are you guys also coming to ask questions? All right, then we'll stop with that. Okay.
It's always a pleasure listening to you, Dr.
Thank you.
Regarding, let's say our leaders 50 to 60 years back, they enjoyed the kind of cartoons that we had at that point of time. But it's unfortunate that the very same cartoons are creating a hue and cry now. Are we increasingly becoming a nation of people who are easily offended by anything, any content?
Very much so. In fact, the gentleman mentioned my column in the Hindu, the Shashi Tharoor column. I did an entire column about this some years ago, about our increasing propensity to be offended. And my answer is, if you're offended, you turn the channel or don't read the book. Why are you denying other people who are not offended the right to enjoy that TV show or that film or read that book? I think it's really sad, but this thin-skinnedness in our society has become a real problem. And it's across the board. It applies to political things, social things, nudity or undress or whatever. All of these things, various self-appointed guardians of our culture have chosen to say, we are offended, therefore it must be banned. And sadly, our government, I don't just mean my party's government, but all governments in the last 15, 20 years, have given in to those who are offended, rather than standing up for the rights of those who have actually produced worthwhile material that, as I said, if you are offended, don't just turn the page.
We need more such sane voices.
You're right.
I have one last question.
On the cartoons, I beg your pardon, I didn't say that, but the fact is that the cartoon in question that created the biggest uproar in Parliament was by the eminent Shankar, who actually won the Padma Shri, the Padma Bhushan and the Padma Vibhushan from Nehruji's hands over the years. He was Nehruji's favorite cartoonist. So nobody at that time saw it as offensive. But unfortunately, today, the thin-skinnedness you're referring to, the propensity to claim being offended, has got to such a point that politically we could not challenge it. I actually said to my party leaders that I don't agree with this and I want to speak against them. They begged me not to. Because in fact, you could not, in that atmosphere, defend that cartoon without coming across in the minds of the custodians of the Dalit community as an anti-Dalit for doing it. And it was not an anti-Dalit cartoon at all. But the point is, once people had taken it to that direction, the political discourse became impossible. And I think out of 32 people who were allowed to speak in Parliament, 31 supported banning these cartoons. It is very, very sad. It really is a reflection of the way in which a certain, when we talk about going viral, a certain mindset can also go viral without the internet. Last question is.
Sir, I am doing my MSW. So, അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ ചോദിക്കുകയാണ്. ഇപ്പോൾ നമ്മുടെ ചുറ്റുവട്ടത്തും നടക്കുന്ന സോഷ്യൽ ഇഷ്യൂസ്. സോ അത്തരം ഇഷ്യൂസ് ഇപ്പോൾ ഉദാഹരണം പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ ന്യൂസ് പേപ്പർ വായിക്കും. നമ്മൾ ന്യൂസ് പേപ്പറിൽ കാണുമ്പോൾ എൻ്റെ ഒരു ഷെയർ ഞാനതിപ്പോൾ സോഷ്യൽ മീഡിയാസ് വഴി ഞാനത് ലോകത്തോട് പറയുമ്പോൾ അതിനോട് റെസ്പോണ്ട് ചെയ്യുന്ന യങ്സ്റ്റേഴ്സിന്റെ എണ്ണം വളരെ ലോ ആണ് എന്ന് ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞാൽ അങ്ങേക്ക് അതിനോട് സപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും. അതിനെ പറ്റി അങ്ങേക്ക് എന്താണ് പറയാനുള്ളത്?
അത് സത്യമാണ്. എല്ലാവരെയും റെസ്പോൺസ് ചെയ്യുന്നവർക്ക് അവർക്കൊരു വിസിബിലിറ്റി കിട്ടും. പക്ഷെ നിങ്ങൾ നോക്കിക്കോളൂ, ഒരു വെബ്സൈറ്റിൽ ഒരു ആർട്ടിക്കിൾ പബ്ലിഷ് ചെയ്ത് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് ഒരു 100 കോമന്റ് ഉണ്ടാകുമെന്ന് വിചാരിച്ചു. പക്ഷെ നമ്മുടെ രാജ്യത്ത് 100 പേര് പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു ചെറിയൊരു മൈനോറിറ്റിയല്ലേ. എന്നാലും അവരുടെ അഭിപ്രായമാണ് എല്ലാവരും വായിച്ചിട്ട് വിചാരിക്കുമ്പോൾ, ഓഹോ ഈ ആർട്ടിക്കിൾ നന്നരാണോ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഈ ആർട്ടിക്കിൾ തെറ്റാണോ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പബ്ലിക് ഒപ്പീനിയനിൽ എതിരാണോ. അത് സത്യമല്ല. It is only those who have taken the trouble to express their view whose voice is heard. പക്ഷെ പല കുറ്റം റെസ്പോൺസ് കൊടുക്കുന്നില്ല. അവർ മനസ്സിൽ വേറെ വല്ല അഭിപ്രായങ്ങളായിരിക്കും. പക്ഷെ അവർ എഴുതിയിട്ടില്ലെങ്കിലും സോഷ്യൽ മീഡിയ ഇട്ടില്ലെങ്കിലും ജനങ്ങൾക്ക് മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ സാധിക്കും. So you're right, there is a difference. So that professor.
Well, the question of pre-censorship of the print media had engaged the attention of the Supreme Court in its very early years. And the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that pre-censorship of print media is unconstitutional.
Right.
Now, when the question of censorship of films came before the Supreme Court focused on the impact of films and approved of the censorship of the films. Now, all throughout your lecture, we were talking about the impact that the social media can have on the public minds. So, in that context, how would you look at the question of constitutional validity of censorship of the social media?
See, I personally am not a lawyer or a legal or constitutional expert. So my views are not based on any constitutional education. But I would argue that, to my mind, our Constitution guarantees freedom of expression, but unlike, say, the American Constitution, it circumscribes it. It circumscribes it with language that says that freedom of expression can be abridged for a number of grounds, including things like friendly relations with foreign countries, risk of public order, public morality, and so on. So the question is, how do you interpret these words in a changing social environment? What is public morality, let's say, in Hindi cinema 40 years ago, is not what you see in Hindi cinema today. So the meaning of morality has been reinterpreted by successive film censorship boards in permitting certain things that would not be permitted 30 or 40 years ago. Societies always evolve. So my argument would be that I hope we evolve in a more liberal direction and not in a more illiberal direction. But you can find constitutional validity for the argument that freedom of expression exists, and you can also find constitutional validity for the argument that restraints and restrictions are permissible. The question is how you interpret those restraints and how you apply them. And in my view, we should, especially in the social media era, try to apply them as minimally and as liberally as possible. Thank you all very much. I really have to go for my